Okay, next in the concepts and terms. It's important to remember that when, again, just to reiterate, which I mentioned before, when you're looking at the concepts and terms, on one hand, it seems like a lot of stuff going by. On the other hand, most of it you've actually heard since you were a kid, certainly here in news reports and everything else. Key here is how it's used in what you might call a technical or professional way versus sort of the general consumption. And of course, all of these are going to be, you're going to see them all semester long in terms of how we talk about what motivates people in particular places, how they get along or not with their neighbors, and in many ways, including their sort of self-identity. And one of the key areas of this would be religion. Religion is a very complicated concept on one hand. On the other hand, it's actually really simple. From sort of what you might call the Western or sort of Euro-American perspective, religion is oftentimes what you'd think of as like a religion, an intro religion class, which might be called text world religions. And that's actually not how anthropologists, geographers see it. So when we're using the term religion in this class, I want you to use it from the standpoint that we use it in the disciplines. And the easiest way to explain this would be going back to Emile Durkheim, the French sociologist, anthropologist in the late 19th century, who was looking at various aspects, including things like suicides in Paris, and became immediately focused on the fact that religion should have something to do with, why people would choose to suicide or not suicide, especially because you have to remember that France then, and actually still is a seriously Catholic country, which, from my understanding of Catholicism, doesn't condone suicide. So, seeing suicide rates made it hard for them to figure out what was going on. And so one of the answers he wanted was, how was religion involved or not involved in this? Then he got into a very complicated situation because France, by the late 19th century, was a huge colonial empire, and Paris wasn't just as cosmopolitan as it is now. And so he suddenly realized very quickly when he started to look at this, he didn't really know what religion consisted of. He knew that it was more than like going to church on Sunday or going to a mass or something like that. And so he finally narrowed it down to the basic concepts, which are what we use now in the social disciplines in terms of what is a religion. His basic premise, which seems to work because it still fits our definition now, is that people have a need for predictability. If you want to think about it in a real simple way, people have to have a need to understand that there's a reason to get up in the morning. And so the idea that, when you go to bed today, you have some idea what's going to happen tomorrow, is this idea of predictability. And he said that people have this need for this. It's inherent in the species, essentially, is that we need to have some sense that there's a reason for thing and what tomorrow's going to be and what yesterday was like. And he said, when you actually look at that premise, then what you find is religion deals with one part of predictability. A lot of predictability is just, direct observation. If you get up in the morning and you go outside and it's raining, you get wet. If you touch something that's hot, you'll get burned. So he pointed out that in his view, a lot of what is predictability is actually answered by ourselves through our own observations. And in the French, he called this the profane. In English, we don't really have a translation for profane, but the closest would be sort of mundane or normal. So he said that when you look at religions don't deal with the normal. Religions don't deal with the mundane, or more accurately, the profane. Well, they don't have to, because we have our own set of answers and our own observations. He said, however, when you look at things, you'll find there's a whole chunk of stuff that doesn't lend itself to that type of observation. If someone passes away unexpectedly, you're going to have a very hard time. There's no way that you can answer that through just observation of why did that happen. And so in that situation, he said that part of our existence, the part that of need for answers that doesn't lend itself to observation, he called that the sacré, which again doesn't really translate into English. Easiest way to think of this would be non-normal. And he said that when you look at religions, regardless of how the religion is structured, regardless of how religion presents itself, religions can always answer the sacré. So religions answer the other than normal. The normal stuff doesn't need religion, and religions don't usually get involved in it. Religions answer the stuff that we can't answer for ourselves through our own experience and observation. In that, what they do is they get us to the answers that provides predictability to, if you would, unpredictable parts of the world or our experience. And that's the function of religion. And that's what all religions do. It doesn't matter whether it's, a small cult in, Northern California, if it's some huge world religion like Catholicism or, Theravada Buddhism, or if it's, something else, if it's a localized religion like, say, traditional Hawaiian belief systems. All of them serve that same function. All of them actually do it equally well. This is one of the really important things to understand about religions. One is you cannot test religions for viability because they're testing stuff that's not subject to observation, so there's no way to test them. You can't prove a religion to be false or true. Religions are based on belief because they're dealing with stuff that's outside of our regular experience. Having said that, this is also one of the fascinating aspects of religion, which isn't part of this class too much, but certainly as, say, anthropology, is that that's why religions, since they're based on belief, can suddenly become huge as a bunch of people become believers. And then also religions can just disappear. A good example in the Roman Empire would be Mithraism, which was a religion that was practiced by a lot of Romans, especially in the Roman army. Almost all of them were members of that religious group. By 300 or 400 AD, about the same time Christianity shows up in the empire, but actually apparently not related to it, that religion just disappears. The people that were believers just quit believing or found other things they believed in more, and the religion stopped. It was never that the religion was false or true any more than any religion is, but it's just that they found maybe dissatisfaction with the answers that it gave to the questions they needed to ask. When you look at religions, then you find there's basically three sort of categories of religions. And I should point out just sort of before I get into that, note that in that situation, for example, I'm right now collecting good luck charms for Chinese New Year's in a couple of weeks. Those would be religious objects. In the Chinese system, they're not actually considered religion, they're considered beliefs, which is true in a lot of Asian systems, like, say, the good luck charms you'd pick up at a Shinto temple in Japan. But from an anthropologist geographer's perspective, since they're dealing with providing predictability for things that are not predictable through observation, they are part of religion. So good luck charms, karamatsu that you put in the front door in Japan and start of New Year's, all these things, St. Christopher's medal in Catholicism, which doesn't actually have the St. Christopher's medal. All of these would be examples of what Durkheim would argue is religion. And that's why it's useful to understand from the anthropological geographic perspective, is that religion isn't limited to formal text-based things with priests or other stuff like that. Religions are very, very complex. They're very, very diverse. And a lot of what people do that are actually religious practices are not part necessarily of what you might call organized religions. And that's a real important distinction to make that generally isn't made by the media or folks in general, especially in the sort of Euro-American perspective, which tend to see religions as very organized, structured things. When you look at religions, then there's basically three types of religions, if we think of it this way. One are what we call universalizing religions. In universalizing religions, one of the basic premises of the religion, regardless of where it comes from, is that every member of usually the species, in other words, everyone who's human, for example, has the ability to be a member of the religion. And then one of the premises then is that's what I call universalizing. In other words, everyone can be a member. One of the side effects of this is that most of these religions at some point, not only can everyone be a member, but then the next part is everyone should become a member. And so these are religions which are firmly convinced that everyone else who's not a member of their religion should become a part of it. Now, where this gets really surreal, and this is why religions get so heavily involved in war and basically killing folks, is the fact that a leap of that further would be if I give you the information on my religion, I'm one of these religions, and you say, nah, I'm comfortable with what I've got. Then one of the premises my religion might have, if I've given you the chance to join and you don't want to, then, for example, as an extreme form, maybe I have to kill you because you won't take up what you should do. Or I might force you to be a part of my religion because my religion is you. Then the phrase you're going to hear with these religions is they're the only true religion. When you hear that phrase, that's almost invariably a universalizing religion. And one of the ways you see this, sort of in the world, is these are religions which have missionaries. So if a religion goes out and proposes its religion to other groups of people, since everyone in the world has a religion or belief system, you're basically asking to supplant the religion they've got for the religion you want to give them. And that's what missionizing is defined as. So missionizing is one of the aspects of universalizing religions. This campus is a good case in point. This is a Marianist campus. The Marianist order is one of the missionizing orders of the Catholic branch of Christianity, and that's the function of this university. As with some of the branches of Catholicism, it's sort of by example. So you missionize by doing things that look good, and you attract other people to the religion. Most forms of Buddhism tend to be the same. They don't knock on the door, for example, and try to force you to join the religion. They're going to basically try to provide an attractive role model so you'll be attracted to the religion, but they're still trying to get you to switch from what you were to what they argue is their version. Fundamentalist religions, as we'll see later, are basically subsets of universalizing religions. If you have a fundamentalist religion, what you basically do is take a universalizing religion, shrink it down to a few basic premises or precepts, one of which is a very little tolerance for anyone other than yourself. And that then becomes the way that you look at the rest of the world. And this is why, fundamentalist Hinduism is an enormous problem. For example, in India, fundamentalist Islam in a lot of Central and West Asia, especially Central Asia right now, and then fundamentalist Christianity in a lot of parts of the world. Different universalizing religions will almost invariably have some branch of them that is fundamentalist, which is sort of like a streamlined, sort of condensed subset of the religion. But one of the aspects of it is it tends to have pretty low tolerance for folks other than themselves. Whereas, in other cases, many universalizing religions in a more general form are actually pretty accommodating, but they still have their basic premise: you should be them. Ethnic religion, and a good example would be the Calvinists come in here in 1821. Calvinism was one of the sort of fundamentalist versions of Christianity that shows up, in the sort of Catholic Reformation period. And it moves to New England. It becomes the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the 1600s. You guys probably know that because that's the Pilgrims that people quote celebrate Thanksgiving. And so that's one of these fundamentalist branches of Christianity. They had very low tolerance for anyone not like themselves, that included other Christians. Basically you were a Calvinist or you were a non-believer. They weren't worried about whether you're Christian or Native American, whatever. You were either us or, whatever. In their later missionizing form, after they sort of calmed down a little bit, they're still pretty fundamentals. They're the ones that arrived here in 1821. Their attitude towards the Hawaiian belief religious system was totally intolerant. Now, of course, they were also the same way with other groups. For example, for 15 years, they were able to keep the Catholics out of Hawaii because in their view, Catholics were no better than any other type of heathen in the sense that they weren't Calvinist. By contrast, the Hawaiian religion, in the sense the religious system that existed here at the time Europeans arrived in 1778, is what we call an ethnic religion. The Hawaiian religion that existed was by and for the population here. It was part of their belief system, was tied to the land and the ocean and the world around them and the people who are part of it. And so one of the interesting things that you see during the period of European context between, say, 1780 and 1820, there's no Hawaiians that go to New England to missionize New Englanders in becoming part of the Hawaiian religious system. I mean, you could, they just never, it's not part of ethnic religions. They don't do missionizing. They see their religion as being pretty specialized to the population that they're a part of. By contrast, the folks in New England, the Calvinists, of course, spent a huge amount of money and effort to come to here in 1821 to missionize the Hawaiians. So this is the clash between a universalizing religion on one hand and an ethnic religion on the other. So ethnic religions tend to be place and group specific, and they're not subject to missionizing. Shinto in Japan would be a good example of an ethnic religion, or Taoism in China. Syncretic religions are religions that, for one logic or another, actually accept the fact that there's multiple forms of religious belief systems which they see as equally valuable. The only one that I'm familiar with that's large would be most of the forms of Buddhism are actually syncretic. So if you go to Japan, the population on one hand does Buddhist ceremonies, but for example, at New Year's, when New Year's, on the 1st, everyone in Japan goes to Shinto temples. For other ceremonies, you go to Buddhist stuff. So the population in Japan moves comfortably between Shinto and Buddhist, two entirely different religions. And Buddhism is okay with that. Buddhism sees other religions as just sort of being different manifestations of religiosity. In traditional China, this would be Taoism and Buddhism. But Buddhism is the only major religion that at least I'm aware of that actually has a sort of syncretic nature that sees other religions as equally valuable expressions. So that's one of the things to grasp, just the idea of religion. The other thing that I really want you to sort of grab here in terms of the way that we define it in anthro and geography is the idea of ethnicity. Ethnicity is an incredibly common term, especially in the 21st century, especially with these multi-ethnic or multi-this or multi-that. It's a huge part of the sort of self-correction, validation system that we use, especially now with social media. But the interesting thing is when you actually think about it, especially here in Hawaii, ethnicity is actually really complicated. And if you ever want to see this, the classic example here in Hawaii would be someone who identifies themselves as ethnic Hawaiian. What does that mean? Who does it consist of? Is there a shared agreement on what it is? And you can argue, depending on island, maybe, maybe not. From an anthro-geo perspective, when we're looking at ethnicity, it actually has two parts, and they're not the ones that you necessarily think of off the top of your head. The first is if you're part of an ethnic group, you self-identify with that group. So you say, I am, that's who I am. That's what I identify with. Now notice that doesn't mean there's only one. This is very true of you if you're from here. You might be Chukis and Japanese and, Anglo or something like that. And you might have identities of all those. But the key there, at least one part of it, is you identify as being part of that. So that's part of who I am, or that is what I am. Now, the other half of this, and remember you need both, is that the group that actually carries that label around with them accepts you as a member. So, for example, if you say if you say I'm Japanese, but the folks here in Hawaii and the folks in Japan who are Japanese don't accept you as a member, then you're not part of that ethnic group. Doesn't matter what you say. Now, notice the reverse is also true. If the group says you are, but you refuse to accept it, you're not part of that ethnic group. My dad's a good example. We're part Native American, but he's never, because of his upbringing, he was never bought into the idea of being Indian. So, he's not ethnically Indian. I am to a certain extent, and my niece certainly is, but not him. So you need both parts of those. So ethnicity is a complicated thing, and it requires both parts: self-identity and group acceptance or group validation. Those are both required for that. Having said that, that's the only thing that defines ethnicity. It's not defined by blood. It's not defined by language. It's not defined by religion. For a very simple reason that those parameters, one, in many cases can't be tested, and two, they vary so much from person to person, it doesn't make any sense. Now, race, on the other hand, can be defined by blood. In fact, that's the only definition of race, is blood quantum of something. So, for example, if I go back to the Wind River Reservation, I'm technically not Arapaho because I don't have the 25% blood quantum to be part of the Arapaho. I am part of the Cheyenne Nation, which is a 10%. And that's because when the US government decided that Indians had to be blood quantumed because they were treating them as a race, then different tribes just decided sort of arbitrarily what numbers they were going to use. And there were, it was like Thursday and the Arapahos did this, Friday the Cheyenne did that. So race is an entirely arbitrary definition. And it's entirely based on what you might call genetic, or more accurately, genealogical logic. And so it's oftentimes people conflate race and ethnicity. They're not the same thing. In some ways, they're oftentimes presented the same way, especially in the United States. But they're certainly not. And a good example would be you could have someone who looks African American, wander around the streets of someplace like, say, Cleveland. But the reality is they might come from the Caribbean, and they might identify themselves as Jamaican. They might come from South America, and they might actually be largely Brazilian Japanese. It could be all sorts of other stuff. But in the American concept of conflation of race and ethnicity, making them into one thing, which is a uniquely American thing, then it's seen differently. I should point out that this is not the same view that people have. For example, you go down to Mexico, where they see ethnicity and race as being very, very different. They have a concept of race, but it's not based on it, as we'll see later in the semester. It's not based on the American premises at all. So the key to ethnicity is it's a two-part deal, and there's no other quantifiers for it. Now, the group that says they're part of a group can actually say, as if you want to be a member of this group, for example, if you want to be French Canadian, they might say, oh, you have to be able to speak French in the French Canadian version, or else you're not going to be a member. So the group might make that part of their quantification, but it's not part of the definition of ethnicity. And what you're going to find is there might be a large chunk, in fact, there is a large chunk of the population that technically is French Canadian, but they really don't speak French on a regular basis and really can't. They can bust out a sentence if they had to, but they're still considered part of the group, sort of, and they self-identify with a group, and so therefore, they're sort of in. And this is sort of the vague aspect you get into it, and you see this with all the ethnic groups here, where ethnicity becomes a very complicated, oftentimes multi-layered phenomena that really doesn't lend itself to some sort of easy, sort of definition. That's why, because it really is entirely variable. So if you would, it's in the eye of the beholder, the individual beholder on one hand, the collective beholder on the other. Ethnocentrism is sort of the final spin on all this. And that's simply the fact that when we look at others, we invariably will judge their behavior and what they're doing and what they're up to on our own set of things that we've learned as we grew up. Ethnocentrism is part in nature being part of a group. If you're going to be part of a group, the group wants you to act like the ways that they expect, i.e. the norms, the normative patterns. And so you grow up with that, and that becomes the normative patterns you take in. And in large part, by the time you're, a teenager, even a little bit later, they become so normal to you, you think of them as the way the world is. And it's not till you bump into other groups that you're actually sort of exposed to the fact that a lot of the world doesn't act the way that you think they should. They don't have the same normative patterns. When you judge others based on your own set of values and parameters, that's ethnocentrism. And it's important to remember that everyone in some way, shape, or form is going to be ethnocentric. If there's someone that says, oh, I'm totally not ethnocentric, I'm totally like there, don't believe them. If anything, they're incredibly naive, or in some cases, they're probably trying to just sort of BS you. A good example, my wife's from Hong Kong. And, on one hand, I don't consider myself particularly ethnocentric. I'm an anthropologist by training, so I'm at least used to it. I'm sensitive to it. But one of the things they love to eat in Hong Kong are giant water beetles, which to me look like cockroaches with really long legs. And all the family are just totally convinced they're really tasty. And there's no way in God's green earth I'm eating those things. And that's an example of ethnocentrism. Food tastes are very ethnocentric. The one thing we both have in common, though they don't do it too much in Hong Kong, Guangdong province, is at least on the reservation, we used to eat dog all the time. And that's a normal, it's soup. It's the meat that you put in soup, and it's good. But for many groups in the United States, their ethnocentrism would be such the idea that you eat a dog is to them absolutely horrifying. In fact, that was one of the stereotypes in the 19th century against Native Americans from Anglo-Americans was they can't be human beings because they're savages because they eat dogs. And I remember my grandma pointing out, well, you eat pigs, so what's the deal? So ethnocentrism is viewing others and judging them from within your own context. Cultural relativity, we don't really get into that too much, but it's sort of one of the themes of the class, is looking at a group from within their own context. Now, it doesn't mean you have to accept it. I mean, I love Hong Kong and I get along fine with my family and everything like that, but I'm not going to eat the Beatles. But that doesn't mean that I don't understand that they like them. It's just if we go down, walking down one of the streets and they're being offered, I'm like, I don't think so. So ethnocentrism and cultural relativity are sort of opposites, but not quite. But ethnocentrism is always in play. And you're going to see it in a fair number of the videos you're going to watch this semester. I'm actually setting them up in such a way that hopefully will trigger some ethnocentrism in you. And so what you want to be aware of when you're being ethnocentric is not that you're not making the judgments, but the awareness that the judgments are from within your own perception. They're not because the other person's doing something that's bad or wrong. It's just in your view, it's not the way it should be.